All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. It's really great to see so many familiar names that's joining us again this morning. And to everyone that's attending for the very first time, welcome. We're delighted to have you with us today. And before we begin to dive into today's webinar topic, I'd like you to think about something for a moment. So every day, perfectly good food leaves production lines without ever actually reaching the customer. Not because it was unsafe or not because a customer rejected it, but because of small inefficiencies that happen every single day. So the interesting part is that most organizations don't even realize where their losses are happening. And if we don't know where they are happening, how can we improve them, right? So there's a saying that I'm going to come back to quite often throughout today's this morning session, and that is what gets measured gets managed, and what gets managed improves. And I think that pretty much perfectly sums up today's webinar. So today, this morning, we're going to unpack where food loss and waste actually occur throughout the food supply chain, how to distinguish between unavoidable losses and preventative waste, and then most importantly, how to start measuring and understanding these losses so that they become opportunities for improvement rather than simply another cost of doing business. So before we dive in, again, thank you for taking the time to join us today. Thank you for everybody that logged in on time. And it's always encouraging to see such a strong turnout because it tells us that this topic is also becoming increasingly important across our industry. And it's always wonderful to see so many familiar names from the previous webinars. We do appreciate the continued support. And for those joining for the first time, again, I hope that this will be the first of many more sessions together. So over the past few months, we have explored a number of food safety topics from FSSC version 7 to HACCP. There was VASCP and TACCP, and also some PRP updates and requirements. And one thing of all of those topics that they have in common is that they help us to produce safe food. So today's webinar does shift that conversation slightly. And we're going to look at something that sits alongside food safety, but also quality and operational excellence, which is food loss and food waste. So this isn't really a webinar about waste. Please, it's not a webinar about waste. It's a webinar about understanding your process, because every kilogram of product that leaves your process unexpectedly has got something to teach us. And for those of you who haven't joined one of our sessions before, my name's Lindri. I'm a food safety consultant and EO builder with Entecom. And much of my work involves helping food businesses translate food safety standards into something that's more practical, measurable, and aligns with the way that the operations actually work in real life. And one of the things that I enjoy most is taking topics that often seem technical or overwhelming and breaking them down into something that's more practical and that the organizations can apply immediately. And that is exactly the approach that we're going to take today. So by the end of today's session, my goal isn't simply that you'll understand food loss and waste a little bit better. I also hope that you'll start looking at your own operation differently and that you'll understand where losses typically occur. So what information is worth measuring, and how small improvements can have a significant impact over time. Because once you see where your losses are, you're already halfway towards reducing them. So just quickly before we dive into today's topic, just a few housekeeping points. Although your microphones and your cameras are disabled to keep the session running smoothly, this is still very much an interactive webinar, so please make use of the chat. There's a Q&A, and there's also your reaction buttons. Use them throughout the session. It's always good, and I enjoy seeing the comments, and also we will also have some time towards the end of the session where we can look at some questions together. So one exciting change that I'd like to share with you is that many of you asked whether our webinars could be available afterwards. And I'm happy to say that we've listened. So from this webinar onwards, our educational webinars will be recorded and they will be made available through our website. and onto our YouTube channel. So if you ever miss a session or you'd like to revisit any of the content or share it with your colleagues, you'll be able to do so. Just bear in mind that today's recording will take a few days to publish and be available. So also, again, this morning, we will be issuing certificates of attendance. So towards the end of the session, Luan will share a short feedback survey in the chat. And once you've completed that, your certificate will generate automatically. And then finally, before we get started, I'd like to get a quick feel for the room about who's joining us today. So I'm just going to ask Luan to launch a short poll for us. And the question is, does your organization currently measure food loss and waste? Is it either A, comprehensively, or perhaps, yes, we do measure waste, B, but only in certain areas, or maybe very limited measurement, C, or D, not currently? So I'm going to give you a moment to just answer that so we can get a feel for where everybody's at. It's looking interesting. Oh, wow. Very equal responses so far. So that is very interesting, as we can actually see that there's quite a mix of maturity levels in the session. So some organizations already have good data available, while others only measuring certain parts of their operation, or perhaps some not measuring at all. And that's also perfectly okay, because today's webinar isn't about having a perfect system already. It's about understanding what information is actually worth measuring in the first place. Okay, so with that, I'm just going to switch my camera off as well for the remainder of the session or towards the end, so we can fully align on the content and just also because we're quite a few people in the call. Right, so yeah, every business measures profit, right? And we also measure production. We measure our deliveries. We also measure our staff. But today's question is, how many organizations accurately measure where they're losing their product? So before we measure it, if we don't measure it, we can't manage it. And if we can't manage it, then we certainly can't improve. So it's like I said earlier, what gets measured gets managed, and what gets managed improves. So just before we start talking about the factories and the production lines and the dashboards, I'd like to just quickly zoom out for just one moment, just to look at the bigger picture, because food loss and waste isn't just a challenge for one business, it's actually a global challenge. So around 1 in every 3 food products produced globally is never eaten. So just think about that for a second. Imagine harvesting 3 truckloads of produce and one entire truck never reaches the consumer. That is what we're saying here. Then also food loss and waste also contribute somewhere between 8 and 10% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. But I'd like to challenge us not to think only about the environmental impact. Let's consider that every kilogram of product that's lost has already consumed water, electricity, labor, transport, packaging. It's gone through cleaning processes and cleaning chemicals and valuable production time. So by the time that the product is discarded, it's all those resources that have already been spent. And then finally, while food is being discarded, around 783 million people around the world continue to experience hunger. That reminds us that reducing food loss isn't simply about improving efficiency. It's also about making better use of the resources that we've already invested in. So now, we can't solve the world's food waste problem this morning, but we can make a much more we can ask ourselves a much more practical question. What does food loss look like inside our own business? Okay, food loss and food waste are often used interchangeably. but they're not the same thing. So if we look at food loss and food waste, before we can reduce any food loss or food waste, we first need to understand the difference. Because although these terms are often used together, they do describe two very different parts of the food chain. Food waste occurs after food is already fit for human consumption, whereas food loss occurs within the processing. These two actually describe very two different parts of the food chain. So if we look at this, let's follow a process flow from one product. Let's imagine a tomato. It starts on the farm, then it gets harvested, it gets transported, processed, it's packed, it's distributed. It's placed on a supermarket shelf, and then eventually it's purchased. But where in this process could we lose the product? If we look at the farm site, there's hail damage. In the factory, there might be changeovers, which we'll spend a lot more time on shortly. And then storage step, there might be temperature failures that can allow us or cause the product to be lost. Within distribution, there's transport damages, retail, perhaps expired stock, and the consumer, perhaps plate waste. So if we bring this back to the previous slide, we can see the farm, factory, and distribution are the green ones, which is our food loss. And then the retail and consumer is food waste. Okay, just to highlight those differences. So for today's webinar, we're going to focus mainly on what happens inside the factory gates, because that's where we actually have the greatest opportunity to measure, to manage, and to improve. Okay, just quickly, before we continue, I'd like to get your opinion on something, and I'm going to launch another quick poll. It should appear on your screen now. Where do you think the greatest food losses occur? A, on the farm, B, processing or warehousing, C, retail, or D, consumer. So just take a few seconds to submit your answer. There isn't really a right or a wrong answer at this stage. I'm simply interested to see where our collective perceptions are. Okay, again, a very neutral divided response so far. Interesting. Okay, so again, that's interesting. As expected, we're quite widespread on our opinions. And some of you believe that the greatest loss occurs on the farm, while others feel it's happening during processing or warehousing. And then some of you are pointing towards retail and even the consumer. So the reason that I asked this question is because our perception isn't always the same as the data. So as we work through the next few slides, I'd like you to keep your answer in the back of your mind, and then we will come back to this question later to see whether today's discussions changed the way that you think about food loss and food waste. Okay, let's imagine a truck. It just arrived at your facility. The fruit looks good. The paperwork is complete. Production is waiting, and everybody tells you to unload it as quickly as possible. But this is actually the first opportunity to either protect the product or to lose it. An incorrect temperature. Perhaps the product has been transported above its required temperature. You haven't lost the product yet, but if that temperature isn't detected during receiving, you very likely already introduced a problem into your process. There's also maybe 1 or 2 pallets that might have been damaged during transport. If they aren't identified immediately, this loss can be isolated. If not, the damage can spread through to the entire load. Sometimes the biggest losses actually start before the product reaches your site. Poor raw material quality often results in higher trimming losses, lower yields, and unnecessary waste during the production process. Nobody enjoys rejecting a delivery, but accepting material that doesn't meet specification usually creates much bigger losses at a later stage. So what should we measure at receiving point? We can measure the number of rejected deliveries, the quantities that was rejected, sorry, temperature deviations, and also your supplier trends, right? Then if we look at storage, we've now accepted the raw materials, we've checked the temperatures, we've inspected the delivery, and the logical response would be surely that the risk has passed, but not quite. In many facilities, storage is where perfectly good product slowly becomes waste. So the dangerous part here is that these losses often happen quietly. It's unlike a production spill or equipment failure. Storage losses tend to accumulate over days or weeks before anyone actually notices. If we look at FIFO, it sounds simple. I think most of us understands the principle, but in a busy warehouse, it's surprisingly easier for newer stock to be placed in front of older stock, right? So before long, a perfectly good product reaches its expiry date, not because there was anything wrong with it, but simply because it wasn't used in time. Then if we look at pest damages, a single bag or pallet can quickly also become much more than a quality issue. Product name may need to be isolated, additional inspections carried out, or in some cases, an entire batch could be affected. So suddenly, a relatively small problem becomes a much larger loss. And then poor stock rotation. This often goes hand in hand with FIFO, but it's also about visibility. If we don't know exactly what stock we have, where it is, or how long it's been there, then we lose the ability to manage it effectively. So good inventory control isn't just good warehouse management. It's one of the best ways to prevent unnecessary waste. And sometimes the product itself is perfectly acceptable, but torn packaging, damaging pallets, moisture exposure, or even poor handling can make the product unsealable. In many cases, this food hasn't failed, the packaging perhaps has failed. And then for storage, it's important to not simply record stock that was written off. We also need to record why it was written off. Was it perhaps expired? Was the packaging damaged? Was that pest activity? Was there a temperature deviation? Because once we start categorizing these losses, that's when the patterns begin to emerge. And once we can see the pattern, we can actually start implementing something to prevent it. Okay, so far, we've looked at the receiving and the storage part. And that while they're both important, if I had to choose one area where most food manufacturers have the greatest opportunity to reduce losses, it would definitely most likely be production. Because production is where people, machines, material, and processes all come together. And where they come together, the variation follows. So think about a typical production day, hundreds, sometimes thousands of kilograms of product that's moving through your process. And every small inefficiency, even if it only happens for a few minutes, can quickly become kilograms or lost product. Let's start right at the beginning. A line that isn't set up correctly. Maybe the filling heads aren't adjusted. Maybe the valve is left in the wrong position, or perhaps the wrong recipe was selected. It only takes one small mistake to lose a significant amount of product before anyone notices. We don't usually think of overfilling as waste. In fact, the customers probably appreciate getting a little extra. But let's put this into perspective. Imagine giving away just 5 grams of extra in every bottle. Multiply that across tens of thousands of bottles, and suddenly we're giving away hundreds of kilograms of products. And not because anything went wrong, but because nobody was measuring it. So underweight products create a different kind of waste. They often result in the product being rejected or reworked or even destroyed. And again, a very small variation can become a big expensive problem. If we think about spills, they're probably the easiest losses to see because everyone notices them, right? The challenge is that we often clean them, and we move on, but we don't actually record them. And unless we're not going to record them, we're never really going to understand why they're happening. So in my experience, one of the biggest hidden sources of product loss is also during changeovers. Remember, we spoke about it earlier. We tend to accept that product will be lost while switching from one product to another. And to some extent, that is true. But the question is, do we know how much? Is it 10 kilograms or 50 kilograms? Or is it 200 kilograms? Or we simply assuming it's part of the process? So equipment failures, they don't just stop production. They often create waste as well. A product sitting in the pipelines, product that's trapped inside equipment, partially completed batches, they all become potential losses. And then cleaning, well, we know it's essential, and nobody's suggesting that we actually clean less, but every additional rinse, every unnecessary flush, every extended cleaning cycle has the potential to increase product losses. So once again, the question becomes, are we measuring it? So hopefully you're starting to notice a pattern by now that none of these examples are particularly unusual. They're actually everyday operational activities. And the difference is that some organizations simply experience them, while others choose to measure them. And once we start measuring them, then they can start improving. Some examples of what we can measure in this production step is changeover losses, product giveaways or overfills, any product that's been rejected, spills, downtime-related losses, rework, yield percentage, even cleaning losses. So let me leave you with this one question. If I had to ask your production manager this afternoon, how much product did you lose during yesterday's changeover? What would they know? Do you think they would know? Or would they estimate? Because those are actually two very different answers. And that's actually the message of today's webinar. We can't improve what we estimate. We can improve only what we measure. So by this stage, we've now successfully produced a perfectly good product. The recipe was correct. The process was under control. The quality checks were passed. And we might even think that we're finished, but we're not. Packaging is still a very real and final opportunity to either protect the product or to lose it. And the frustrating part is that many packaging losses have absolutely nothing to do with the food itself. Let's start with the labels. Imagine you've produced 10,000 bottles of product. Everything inside the bottles is perfect, but the wrong allergen statement, or the wrong date code, or the wrong product label is applied. Suddenly, thousands of perfectly good products can no longer be sold, not because of the food, but because of the information that's printed on the outside. So the same applies to coding, missing batch numbers, unreadable dates, incorrect best before dates. They can all quickly turn into compliant product, or turn a compliant product into something that has to be reworked or perhaps even destroyed. So once again, the food hasn't failed, the packaging has. Seal integrity is another common source of loss. Even a small sealing problem can affect the shelf life, the product safety, or even the customer confidence. The earlier that we can detect this, the smaller the loss, but the later that it's detected, the greater the impact, right? So again, hopefully you're starting to notice the common theme here. In almost every area that we've discussed, the organizations tend to record that something happened, but not always why it happened. And if we don't understand the reason, then we can't eliminate it. So if I could recommend just one improvement in packaging, don't simply count the rejects, start categorizing them. Was it a label? Was it a coding issue? Was it a seal failure or a damaged carton? Because once you start to categorize these packaging losses, you'll very quickly identify where to focus your improvement efforts on. So by this point, we've done everything right. We've accepted the good raw material, stored them correctly, produced a quality product. The packaging was successfully, but surely now the hard work is over. But the last step, not necessarily. The finished goods still present one of the biggest investments in your business that your business has to make. So every kilogram sitting in your warehouse already contains the raw material, the labor, the packaging, the utilities, the machine time, the transport costs. And if we lose this product now, then we've pretty much lost everything that we've invested up to this point. So expired stock is one of the clearest examples of preventable waste. The product hasn't failed because it was unsafe. It often hasn't even failed because of poor quality. It simply wasn't sold, or maybe it wasn't rotated or dispatched in time. And that's why expiry should never just be recorded as expired. We should be asking, why did it expire? Customer returns are also another valuable source of information. So sometimes they're caused by genuine quality issues, but sometimes they link to transport damage. Sometimes they're simply the result of incorrect ordering or overstocking. Every return actually tells a story, and every story is an opportunity to improve on. And then finally, we also have transport damage. A product may leave your warehouse in a perfect condition, but poor pallet stacking, damaged packaging, incorrect loading, or even poor temperature control during the distribution step can still result in unnecessary losses before it reaches the customer. And once again, understanding why the loss has occurred is far more valuable than simply recording that it has actually occurred. So let's just reflect on this journey that we've taken so far. We started with raw material arriving at the gate. It moved through storage. Then there was production. Then we discussed packaging and also finished goods. And at every single stage, we identified opportunities for product to be lost. But hopefully you've also noticed something else, that none of these losses are just waste. They're information about where your process can be improved. And that's why measuring them is so important. There's quite a long list of examples. Can be, like we said, rejected deliveries, expired stock, changeover losses, packaging errors. But are they really the root causes? If we investigate them properly, we usually find that they come back to a handful of underlying causes. So it's either a people issue. Sometimes the issue isn't the lack of effort. It can be training, or it can be communication, or simply people that's not understanding why the process exists in the first place. Then there's also equipment. Doesn't only cause downtime. It can also cause product loss. Let's say poor calibration, or worn components, or breakdowns. And all of these result in inconsistent performances. It can also be process. So if you think, the process one, I actually think deserves quite an emphasis. And this isn't, process is probably one of the biggest categories that we encounter losses in. There's poor changeovers, like we've mentioned. There might be inefficient cleaning, inconsistent procedures, perhaps even weak production planning. And the process itself often creates waste. Okay, then also sometimes the process might be working perfectly, but the raw material might have been inconsistent. There might be damaged packaging, poor supplier performance. All of these increase losses further downstream. And then finally, there's also factors that we don't always control, which is temperature, humidity, power interruptions, storage conditions, all of those. So even the physical layout of the facility, these environmental factors can quietly contribute to losses over time. And then I think one of the biggest ones that is often overlooked is the measurement, which is sometimes the biggest root cause. It's not always the people or the equipment. It's simply that nobody realized that there was a problem. If we aren't measuring these losses, then we don't know why they're happening. And if we don't know why, we obviously can't improve on them. Again, like we said, what gets measured gets managed, and what gets managed improves. So perhaps the biggest lesson isn't that we have hundreds of different waste problems. It's that we often have a handful of recurring issues appearing in different parts of the business, which is actually good news if you think about it. Because if we can identify these recurring causes, then we can focus our improvement efforts where they need to happen, and it can have a much bigger impact. So throughout this session this morning, we've identified a lot of different opportunities for product loss, but simply knowing that losses occur doesn't always improve everything or anything. We have to start turning those losses into information. And that's where measurement becomes so important. So think back about the production example. Imagine somebody tells you we lost product during yesterday's changeover. Well, that's useful, but it's not really actionable information, right? But we lost 42 kilograms during line 3 while changeover from product A to B for the third time this month. That is that gives us some insight, right? So now suddenly that you know exactly where to focus your improvement efforts. So the data doesn't necessarily solve the problem. The questions that we ask ourselves solve the problem. The data simply helps us to ask the right question or to look in the right place. So rather than asking how much waste did we generate, perhaps we should ask where was this waste? Why did we generate the waste? How often are this waste generated? Exactly how much waste was generated? And what has changed recently that might cause this generated waste? So once we start collecting this information consistently, then something interesting begins to happen. We actually stop managing individual instances and we start managing our trends. Okay, so at this point, I'd like to just quickly launch a quick poll based on everything that we've discussed this morning. Okay, the question is, what causes the most waste at your site? Do you think it's A, receiving? I can see 100% so far on production. Okay, okay, is it A, receiving, B, storage, C, production, or D, packaging? It does look like we had quite a few people that agree with all the losses that can occur at production. And I tend to absolutely agree with you. But I think it's also important that we have a good, that we focus on our entire process. But thank you everyone for submitting your answers. That's very interesting. And as expected, I think most of us tend to focus on one particular area, which is production. And in many organizations, that is probably true. But I'd also like to encourage you to think about waste that really starts and ends at one department. A production loss may actually have started with poor raw material quality during receiving, or an expired product in the warehouse might really be the result of the inaccurate production planning. Or a packaging rejection could have its root cause in the equipment maintenance. So while we naturally tend to focus on one department, reducing food loss and waste is really a cross-functional effort. But I think it's very important that we that we do measure our production losses. Thank you everyone for submitting and participating. And then, just the simple funnel in the picture really captures the message that we've been discussing today. Everything starts with product loss, but product loss is in its own doesn't actually improve anything. We first need to measure it. We need to look at how much was lost. where did the losses happen, and why did it happen. Then once we have all that information, we can analyze it, and then we can start identifying patterns and trends. So those trends will allow us to implement improvements, and then implement the improvements where they will actually have the greatest impact. And then finally, we can measure again to verify whether those improvements actually worked and had an impact. And then that becomes the cycle of continuous improvement. So it's not about recording waste for the sake of reporting. It's about turning those losses into information, information into action, and action into measurable improvement. Because like we said earlier today, and a few times this morning, what gets measured gets managed, and what gets managed can improve. So far we focused a lot on the principles. We've seen that food loss and waste occur throughout the manufacturing process, and more importantly, that every loss has the potential to tell us something about our operation. But of course, the next question is, how do we actually manage all of this information? So because spreadsheets, notebook, and isolated reports can only take us so far, to really drive continuous improvement, we need a simple and consistent way to record incidents, investigate recurring causes, assign improvement actions, and monitor these trends over time. So I'd like to just spend the next few minutes showing you a practical example of how this process can be managed digitally with EO. And as you watch the demonstration, I'd like to encourage you to not focus on the software itself, but rather on the process. Notice how every reported loss becomes information, how every investigation becomes an opportunity to learn from, and every improvement can be measured to determine whether it was effective. Because ultimately, that's what today's webinar is all about, turning production loss into continuous improvement. Right, thank you everyone for watching that. Hopefully that demonstration has shown that recording product losses is only the beginning, and that the real value comes from the information that we extract from that data. So management doesn't need hundreds of individual reports. They actually need meaningful information that helps them to make better decisions. Excuse me. For example, what was the overall production yield? Which department is generating the highest losses? Are these losses increasing or decreasing month by month? What's actually costing us the most? And perhaps the most important question, why are these losses happening? Once we have the answers to all these questions consistently, then only we can start moving beyond simply recording the waste. We're now actually using the information to drive continuous improvement. And that is exactly where every organization should aim to be. If you think about, if you remember how we started today's webinar, we said that every loss tells a story. So by measuring consistently, we allow these stories to become trends, and the trends become insights, and those insights help us to become better decisions. And that is what continuous improvement looks like. We spent quite a lot of time, a bit of time to understand where food loss occurs and what causes it, and why measuring it is so important. And the good news is that reducing the food loss doesn't usually require any major capital investments. More often than not, it's about making lots of small improvements consistently. So let's finish today's session by looking at some of the practical ideas that almost every food business can begin implementing. Let's start looking at where our process starts. Again, the receiving. One of the simplest ways that we can reduce waste is to stop the problems before they enter the factory, before the supplier approval processes. We have clearer specifications. We can have better approval processes. We can have better specifications, and we can have more consistent temperature verification. All of these help prevent downstream losses. So every rejected load is valuable information about the supplier performance. Then if we look at production, this is where we identify the biggest opportunities for improvement. We can look at more clearer work instructions, more efficient changeovers, as well as well-maintained PRPs, which all help reduce unnecessary losses. And then one question that I'd actually at this point encourage every production manager to ask is, where do we lose the most product during a normal production day? And you might be able to answer that, or you might need to look at data to answer that, or you might need to implement some monitoring to get the data to answer that question accurately. Then good warehousing management. So this isn't just about the inventory. It's about protecting the product value, better stock visibility, more accurate inventory, and effective FIFO to help ensure that perfectly good product reaches the consumers instead of becoming waste. And then I'm hoping that you did notice something. None of these improvements are actually particularly complicated. They are all simply good operational practices, which gets measured consistently. The only key difference. Then, sorry, we often think food loss is a process problem, but in reality, it's also a culture issue. If the employees understand why the product losses matter, they're far more likely to start reporting them, to help investigate them, and more importantly, to help prevent them. Creating awareness, in this case, is one of the most cost-effective improvements that any organization can make. And then also finally, management, which sets the direction. If the waste is only discussed during audits, nothing will ever change, right? But if it's reviewed regularly and the trends are analyzed and there's improvement actions that are assigned, and there's also successes that are celebrated, then reducing waste becomes part of the organization's culture rather than just another KPI. Another improvement, continuous improvement, in this case, isn't just about making one big change. It's about making a lot of small improvements that add up over time. So consistency here is key, and that allows continuous improvement. So throughout today's webinar, we've spoken a lot about reducing food loss and waste, but the benefits of reducing it extends far beyond simply reducing the amount of product that ends up in the bin. The organizations begin measuring and managing losses effectively. When they start doing that, then they strengthen as many other parts of the business as well. So first and foremost, this food loss measurement is a continuous improvement tool, like we've discussed a few times this morning. It helps organizations move away from assumptions towards decisions that's based on real information. So again, that emphasizes that every trend that's identified, every improvement that's implemented strengthens your system. And we also become much more efficient with our resources. Remember what we said earlier? Every kilogram of product represents much more than waste. It represents raw material, electricity, water, labor, packaging, and of course the valuable production time. So reducing these losses means using all of these resources more effectively in return. And one of the biggest changes that we often see isn't in the numbers, but it's in the culture. So when the employees understand why the losses are being measured and how their actions contribute to the improvement, they become more engaged in protecting both the product quality and the food safety. Measuring these losses creates conversation, and the more conversations that we have, it helps us to build a stronger food safety culture. And then finally, reducing food loss is really a journey towards better decision making. So better planning, better communication, better maintenance, better data all contribute to more consistent operations And that's something that every organization is striving for. So when we measure consistently, we do not reduce the waste, we make better decisions. And these principles also align very closely with what we see across modern food safety and quality standards. So whether it's BRCGS, FSSC 22000, or GFSI recognized schemes, there is an increasing expectations that organizations understand their processes, monitor performance, analyze the trends, and demonstrate continual improvement. Measuring food loss and waste actually supports all of these objectives. So let's finish with a simple example. A food manufacturer started recording product losses during every changeover. At first, nothing has changed. They simply collected the information, but then after a few weeks, a clear pattern started to emerge. And the majority of their losses weren't caused by equipment failures. They occurred during one specific product changeover on one production line. So once they had the data, the solution became obvious. They reviewed the changeover procedure, they standardized the cleaning sequence, retrained the operators, and monitored the results over the following few months. And then the outcome wasn't just less product loss. The changeover actually became faster. Production became more consistent. The waste reduced, the waste did reduce because they focused on the real cause of the problem and not the assumptions that was made. And that's actually really the message that I'd like everyone to take away today. They didn't reduce waste because they worked harder. They reduced waste because they understood their process better. And they understood why, then because they understood their process, they could start measuring it. Okay, so before we close off today's webinar, I'd like to leave you with something practical. We've covered quite a lot this morning, and I certainly don't expect everyone to go back to work on tomorrow and then suddenly start measuring 20 different things. Instead, I think I'd like to encourage you to start small. So if you can do these 5 things next week, then you'll actually already be taking an important step towards reducing food loss and food waste within your organization. And the first thing is to walk your process and observe where the product is being lost. Ask your team where they believe the biggest losses occur. Start measuring one source of loss that you're not currently monitoring. Review that information consistently for a month. And then finally, share what you've learned with your team. Because the objective isn't simply to collect the data, it's to create the conversation, to identify the opportunities, and then in return to continuously improve. So at the beginning of today's webinar, I said that perfectly good food leaves production lines every single day. And my hope really is that today's session has shown that those losses don't have to remain hidden. Every loss tells a story. Every story is an opportunity to improve. And every improvement starts by measuring what matters. And because what gets measured gets managed, and what gets managed improves. So thank you all very much for joining us this morning. I really appreciate each one of you taking the time out of your busy schedules and spending the morning with us. We hope that you found the session practical, informative, and that you'll leave with at least one idea that you can apply to your own organization.